Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Many of you are familiar with Elders Climate Action, but for those of you who don't know as much about us, we are the elders, including grandparents, great aunts, great uncles, and just folks who care about the future for all children and for future generations. As Elders Climate Action members, we are determined to do all we can to leave a sustainable planet for future generations. Our programs, communications, and chapters seek to inform, inspire, and engage others across generations to take action on the climate crisis on the local, state, and national levels. ECA is elder-centered and volunteer-driven. You can learn more about us, get more involved, and take a look at eldersclimateaction.org. Now, during this call, this is going to be an hour-long presentation. We'll have a relatively brief presentation by our guest speaker to be followed by a Q&A. So please feel free to add your question to the speaker in the Q&A box. Please use the Q&A box other than the chat for that. So to introduce our speaker, many of you who had originally registered for the call thought it was going to be with Danny Hupper. We have a slight change this evening. We're very happy to be joined by Hannah Reid, one of Danny's colleagues from Evergreen Action, who's been very focused on tonight's topic of regulatory action. Hannah serves as Evergreen Action's outreach coordinator. She spent most of her career working in electoral organizing, including as a campus organizer for Next Gen Florida in 2018, a South Carolina field organizer for Pete Buttigieg's presidential campaign, and the regional organizer director for South Pinellas County for the 2020 Florida Democratic Coordinated Campaign. Most recently, she has served as a special assistant to the Deputy Chiefs of Staff and a special assistant to the director of the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity at the Department of Energy. Originally from Indiana, Hannah Reid graduated from the University of Tampa with a BS in Environmental Science. So please take it away, Hannah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. I am really excited to talk to you a little bit about some of the EPA's regulatory docket. So let me just pull up my presentation real quickly. Okay, so I wanted to just take some time today to tell you all a little bit about EPA's pollution rules, which is currently what Evergreen believes to be the biggest climate opportunity at our disposal. So first of all, a little bit of background about Evergreen Action, the organization that I work for. So Evergreen is a nonprofit that was founded in 2019 by veterans of Jay Inslee's climate-focused presidential campaign. Jay Inslee, when he was running for the 2020 race, had one of the most comprehensive climate plans that any of the presidential candidates had. And when he decided to step away from the race, his staff wanted to find a way to take that climate plan and put it into action in whatever administration came next. And so Evergreen was born. And our mission is to lead an all-out national mobilization to defeat the climate crisis. And within that, there's a lot of different strategies that we can take. So previously, we had done a lot within Congress. Evergreen was very involved in the fight for Build Back Better, as well as the fight that eventually became the Inflation Reduction Act. But knowing that Congress is no longer as effective a place to push forward climate legislation, we're pivoting a lot to look at state action as well as executive action. And so one of the goals for today for me is to provide you all with information and tools that you can use to strengthen EPA's pollution rules, which is an executive action. So there are 10 major EPA regulations that we have been focusing on. We had an artist create this really beautiful graphic, but this really just highlights the big ones. So the first two, and the two I'll probably talk about the most today, is the carbon standards for new and existing power plants, or something that we call 111B and D. It's called 111B and D because that is the provision in the Clean Air Act that allows the EPA to set standards for how much power plants can emit in terms of carbon. Some of the other power plant rules that we've been focusing in on is the National Smog Standard, the Regional Haze Rule, Toxic Water Pollution Rule, closing startup, shutdown, and malfunction loopholes, stronger national standards, stronger mercury and air toxin standards, the Good Neighbor Rule, and coal ash. Evergreen has been maintaining this report card that we have for the EPA, which really highlights all of the different regulatory action that we want to see from the EPA. So as you can see, there's a few places for improvement. The good neighbor rule is the one standard that the administration has finalized. We are actually currently waiting on a final vote for the good neighbor rule from Congress. Unfortunately, we don't feel like this vote is going to happen before the August recess, but we expect that this rule will be officially finalized in September when Congress comes back into session. And that rule really deals with emissions across state lines. Some of the other rules that we are seeing that are not getting as much attention right now is the National Smog Standard and the Regional Haze Rule. Those rules have been delayed, and unfortunately, we have some concerns about them being addressed within the first term of the Biden administration. But thankfully, a lot of these other rules, the Biden administration has been taking as high priority as we have. The mercury and air toxin standard of the MATS rule and the coal ash rule recently closed a comment period where we were pretty content with those rules. For the mercury and air toxin standard, we did want them to improve that standard a little bit, and we had a very, very effective comment collection period, so we're hoping that that will be strengthened. But the coal ash rule we've been pleased with. The SIT standard, similarly to the MATS standard, we're hoping can be strengthened, but we're seeing a lot of positive movement. The two biggest ones that, again, I want to talk about is the carbon standards for new and existing power plants. But why are we wanting to talk about these rules? Why are they so important? So air pollution is at a level in the United States where it's a moral crisis. Air pollution is killing 7 million people globally every year. And in the US, it contributes to 100 to 200,000 deaths a year. So from a public health standpoint, we need to be taking care of our air. But separate from that, fossil fuel combustion is the leading driver of the climate crisis and environmental injustice. So if we're going to be serious about addressing climate change, we need to address this pollution. With the passage of the IRA, we do believe that we will see a 30 to 40% reduction in emissions in the United States, which is fantastic. But we know that we need to get at least to 50% emission reductions by 2030, and that cannot happen with just the IRA. We need some executive action to get to that point, which brings us to these EPA standards that we're talking about today. If the EPA would do more, they could actually get us to 77% clean energy by 2030. And so that's what we're pushing for with these strong standards. The most recent standard, the one that I've been kind of foreshadowing this whole time, is the proposed new climate pollution rules for power plants, which was released on May 11th and which has an open comment period. So we are hoping to take action on this right now. The rule that came out on May 11th was pretty strong. We were pleased with it, but we think that there are ways that it could be strengthened to really address a lot of the public health and climate change concerns that we are trying to bring to the administration. And if these rules are strengthened, we think we could reduce more greenhouse gas pollution than any other federal policy that President Biden could take right now. So what do these rules do? Basically, the 111B and D rules, the power plant emission rules, regulate the amount of CO2 that power plants can emit. Right now, coal and gas plants can release unlimited CO2, and these rules would require utilities to switch to cleaner forms of energy to diminish the amount of CO2 that they are producing. So this is a really big deal for the climate. The way the rule is structured right now, many plants would have to reduce their pollution by 90% by either 2030 or 2035. That's fantastic. That means that these power plants would be switching over to cleaner energy sources, renewable energy sources, which would first of all save money, but also significantly reduce the amount of carbon that we're putting out into the atmosphere to get us to those levels that President Biden has said we're shooting for, 50% by 2030 and 80% by 2035. So how can the EPA strengthen the rules that are currently out there right now? So one of the big concerns we have with the existing gas plant rule that was released is that less than 10% of gas plants would be covered. And while about half of the pollution that gas plants are putting out would still be cut. Half of that pollution would still be unregulated. The 10% that this plan would cover are the biggest polluters, but there are still too many polluters that are going to be allowed to pollute basically unregulated. So we really want to see that strengthened within the rule. And with the comments that we're hoping to submit soon, that is one of the things that we highlight for the administration. They need to have more gas plants covered. The other thing that we're really concerned about is compliance timelines. Right now, a lot of these plants would not be required to begin phasing down the amount of emissions that they're putting out until 2035. But we know that we need to cut emissions in half by 2030. So with the rule written as now, there is no incentive for gas plants to move quickly, and we need these gas plants to move quickly. So like I said, within the comments, we are pushing for faster, sooner deadlines and covering of more plants. So that is basically what we're talking about in terms of 111B and D. I guess I got through this a little bit more quickly than expected, but I would love to jump into any questions because a lot of these rules are kind of complicated, and the actions that we're hoping folks to take are complicated as well.
Please put your questions in the Q&A.
I have a question while we're waiting for the audience, and that is, if we're asking if the EPA wants to control emissions from power plants, is carbon capture technology being allowed and implemented in this process?
That is a really great question. So unfortunately, because of the Supreme Court ruling last year in West Virginia versus EPA, the EPA is limited about what sort of actions they can require power plants to take, and they're limited to what's called within the fence line technology. So they can't force power plants to cut emissions by forcing them to just switch over to renewable energy sources. That's what we want them to do. We want them to switch over to wind, solar, things that we know that are cheap, things that we know that are ready to go. But the Supreme Court has said we can't force them to do that. So as a result, the way the rule had to be written was that these power plants needed to be able to cut their emissions by using within the fence line technologies, which includes carbon capture. So yes, in theory, power plants could choose to, rather than switch over to renewable energy sources, use carbon capture. Our hope is that this won't happen because it's more expensive to do that. Carbon capture is not a cheap technology. It's not something that we anticipate, especially for new gas plants being built. We don't anticipate them choosing to use carbon capture. We anticipate them choosing to go the renewable route because we do know it's cheaper. But unfortunately, because of the Supreme Court, there is a possibility that there are plants that will choose to build on carbon capture. So we're a little bit limited by our Supreme Court right now, as we so often are.
Okay. Question we've got, the issues you covered were all national. What about dealing with the amount of gasoline we use coming from overseas?
So unfortunately, a lot of the actions that the EPA is able to take, they're really limited to within the United States. So when it comes to like gasoline and different things overseas, there's not a lot of executive action that the Biden administration can do. There's actions that they can take jointly with Congress, but unfortunately, Congress is a really difficult place to get things done right now. So we're a little bit limited. But when it comes to like oil and gas and the build out of oil and gas within the United States, the EPA does have some control. That's why we're really pushing hard on this power plant rule. Like 25% of emissions come from these power plants, and we really want to cut that down as much as possible.
Yeah, we're really focusing on executive action tonight, which is a really important area. Got a question: where does the military fit into your plans? Military around the world is a large emitter of carbon into the atmosphere.
So Within these within these EPA regulations, there's not a lot of overlap with the military, but something that we are seeing right now in Congress is there are certain steps within the IRA that were taken to try to address some of the carbon emissions that we see from the military, by like electrifying some of their fleet and things like that. We actually see Republicans in Congress right now trying to take away some of those wins and take away some of that funding. One of the things that we can do about that is to, talk with our representatives and encourage them not to allow those bad provisions in our military spending bills. But within executive action right now, there's not much that the administration can do other than continuing to try to like allocate funding towards these these cleaner power sources. Executively, there's not a lot that can happen right now. Again, that's something that we'll have to go through Congress for.
So someone else is asking, gas power plants are one of the major sources of CO2, but buildings are also major users of methane. Will they be addressed at the national level or only at the state level?
Well, that's something that Evergreen is actually trying to really look into right now. We're more focused in on the clean power space. A lot of the work that we do is around clean power, but we've recently started to do a lot of research and investment into clean buildings, and even buildings not as just a climate solution, but a housing and equity solution. We're exploring how best to present those policies right now, but we're really in the early stages. So maybe in a few months, a year, I can come back and be like, this is what we're going to do about buildings. But that's just not our area of expertise.
Okay. So how easy or hard is it to switch a power plant from fossil fuels to renewables?
So one of the things that has made that challenging is FERC, and I'm trying to think of what FERC stands for right now. It's totally slipping my mind, but it's another government like regulatory entity that deals with transmission. So getting power from power plants and transmitting it to like everybody else. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Yes, thank you so much. Right now, FERC is hopefully going to be voting on some rules in the very near future to make it easier to switch over from fossil fuels to renewables. But there are some permitting concerns that have made that a little bit difficult. And right now, FERC is largely at the control of Joe Manchin. And so that also limits like how ambitious we can be in doing some of that transmission reform, some of that renewable reform. But it is very much feasible for these power plants to switch from fossil fuels to renewable. And something that we've been talking about a lot is renewables are cheaper. Like coal is one of the most expensive energy forms out there right now. And so really it would be great if our utility companies were going to these power plants saying, hey, we want you to switch over to renewables because it'll be cheaper on the consumer. And so hopefully they will be incentivized to do that, because in the long run, renewables are much cheaper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of the opposition to clean energy transition is coming from the fossil fuel industry. What can we do to head off those fossil fuel arguments? So
I think that's a really tough question. I think it depends on what specifically you're talking about. I know for the carbon power plant rules that we've been talking about, one of the big complaints from the fossil fuel industry is, well, it could affect grid reliability. We've done a lot of research that shows that we don't think it will affect grid reliability. And so amplifying that type of research, amplifying those types of resources that show the administration and show naysayers, no, actually, there is no grid concerns with these power plant rules. That's something you can do to kind of deal with some of that opposition from the fossil fuel industry. Another thing is talking about concerns to consumers, ratepayers, having people's utility bills go up. We know that coal is more expensive than renewable energy. That is just something that is an easy Google search away. So continuing to combat that narrative with, well, renewables are cheaper. And over time, there's a lot of evidence to show that separate from renewables being cheaper, climate change is going to get very, very expensive. And so if we're wanting to save money, we need to address that. And Evergreen has put out a few different resources kind of about how to combat some of those bad talking points. I will drop into the chat at some point our website that has, all of our blogs, all of our papers that we've written about this, because a lot of that fossil fuel opposition is really easy to counter if you have the proper talking points.
Great. So we're hearing a lot of opposition to the clean energy transition. People who talk about the variability of solar and wind. How can we argue with that objection?
That's a great question. I think it's important to note that this isn't something that is happening overnight. A lot of this build out is slow and steady. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get rid of fossil fuels tomorrow. As we are continuing this transition, the technologies are becoming better and better. Battery storage is becoming better. We're seeing that there are certain parts of the country where these renewables are the most effective. There's a mountain in West Virginia that has a ton of wind that has not been harnessed yet. And so there is, money available at the Department of Energy that they're hoping to send to build out wind in that area. And then they're hoping to build out battery storage so that when it's not windy, there's still energy stored. So the technologies are keeping up with the transition. People who are saying that the technologies are not keeping up with the transition aren't paying attention to where the technologies are at, because we're there. There's there's states that are powered more by renewables than they are by coal and things like that. So
we have a lot of these power plants that need to be retired. What should happen to the infrastructure that they have, and how do we integrate new sources of power?
that is a great question. I think that is something that some of these IRA programs that are out there are seeking to address. I wish I knew some of the programs off the top of my head, but these are things that the administration is proactively thinking about. Some of that infrastructure can be repurposed for renewables, but some of that infrastructure can't. And so there will have to be some sort of brown zone cleanup for those areas, because a lot of them, these power plants, they're not safe places for people to build on. So there would have to be some sort of cleanup before we would be able to build something new there. But a lot of the places they can be repurposed for other sorts of manufacturing or other sorts of power generation.
In Maryland, we're looking at putting solar farms on some of these places because they already have a big grid tie. I mentioned there's a whole neighborhood in Framingham, Massachusetts, that's considering a network geothermal project. It's good for heating and cooling. So how can we get more projects like that?
So a big part of that is encouraging your communities, encouraging your utilities, all of these different areas to go after these IRA funds. I'm not sure if any of you all live in a rural area that is serviced by a rural electric co-op, but there's an IRA program that has there's two IRA programs that combined have almost $11 billion in funding that are just to giving money to rural electric co-ops to transition away from fossil fuels. What we're needing right now is for these rural electric co-ops to go after that money. And right now, there was a deadline of September 15th where these electric co-ops need to submit a letter of intent that would say, yes, we want to go after these funds so that they can transition to a renewable energy source. So if you live in an area serviced by a rural electric co-op, you can contact your rural electric co-op and be like, are you submitting a letter of intent to the USDA for these IRA funds? Because I want my area serviced by renewables. I don't want my area to continue to be serviced by fossil fuels. And candidly, it's really hard to keep track of all of these different funding opportunities that can be service to your community. But one of the best things you can do is think about what you want to see in your community, and then go and look at what funding is out there and see who you can organize to get it. It's hard. It's really hard, but there are programs out there.
Yeah, there's a lot out there. Another question: how do you fight the profit motive to continue using fossil fuels?
So, I mean, I would counter that with saying that there's profit in the green energy space. There's profit in the renewable space. Like I've been saying, fossil fuels are more expensive. They're more costly. And yes, these companies, they have their profit incentive is to stick with what they know. But we have a lot of power as community members, and we need to show that like there is money to be made in these renewables as well. Not that you want money to be the incentive. We want the incentive to be the health and safety of the people who live in these communities. But a lot of these companies, money talks. And right now there is billions of dollars of funding from the administration to switch over to renewables. So finding a way to incentivize these companies to take that money and build out the infrastructure that you want.
Now, the question about biomass, that biomass is certainly very polluting and not the kind of climate solution that it's been promoted to be. But what do we do about that?
So I actually, unfortunately, don't really know much about biomass, so I'm not sure I'm the best to answer that question.
And that's fine. Nobody can be an expert on all the things that people are coming up with. They're all great questions, but another question that may not be in your area is about public transportation, that we really need better public transit, but is there much talk about actually building that?
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely a frustration. I think personally, I'm a big public transit person. I definitely want to see a build out of public transit. I think that is a little bit more limited because it's local governments that have to get involved in that. But something that is encouraging is the Biden administration recently put out rules for heavy duty and light duty vehicles. So one of the things the administration, similar to what we've been talking about with the power plants, is there's regulations around vehicle manufacturing, and a recent rule for light duty vehicle manufacturing came out that would force, basically the way it works is these manufacturers they manufacture a certain number of cars, and those cars collectively can only emit a certain amount. So this new rule is a way to force manufacturers to manufacture more EVs and more low emission vehicles. So while we would love to see public transit take off, because truthfully, we just need to get cars off of the road, it is something that you can rest well knowing is that this new light duty vehicle rule will significantly decrease the amount of emissions that cars are putting out. There's also a rule out right now for heavy duty vehicles that is open for comment collection. We would like to see that rule strengthened a little bit, but the light duty vehicle rule we were really, really pleased with, and we are just hoping that that strong rule can be finalized.
So can you tell us something about the comments that Evergreen is making to strengthen the power plant rules, and what's missing from the current drafts?
Yeah, so give me 1 second. I actually have the link that I would love to drop for you all for our comments. But like I said earlier, the big thing for us is we think that they need to cover more gas plants. Right now, while the biggest polluters are covered, a lot of plants that are still putting those toxins into the community, people are breathing that air, they're not covered, and we want to get some of those plants either closed down or transitioned over to renewables. And then the other thing is compliance timelines. Right now, a lot of these plants wouldn't be required to really act until 2030, 2035. We need that to be pushed up. We need these plants to be addressing this issue right now. Our goal is to decrease emissions by 50% by 2030. How are we going to do that if the plants don't even have to start decreasing emissions until 2030 or 2035? So here, I think this is, that might not have gone to everyone, I realize, but I will make sure that you all can get, Jen is going to make sure that you all get the link to our comments. And I know you all also have your own comment collection that is very similar to ours. The big thing, like I said, compliance timelines and covering more plants.
But what are some of the ways the public can engage with the EPA? Do you foresee additional proposed rules in the next 12 months? And what efforts are happening to ensure that these EPA rules are finalized before the next election?
Yeah, so actually, the biggest way that the general public can engage with the EPA is through these open comment periods. So right when these comment periods are open, anyone could submit a written comment. Generally, they also have a public testimony. For this particular rule, those public testimony days have already passed, but the EPA doesn't weigh differently written comments versus public testimony comments. So there's still plenty of time to submit comments. Anytime the EPA submits one of these rules, they are obligated to do public comment. And it is always good to submit comment whether you would like the rule to be strengthened or whether you're happy with these rules, because a lot of these, I don't want to say like a lot of our enemies, but a lot of the folks that we are fighting against, they will be submitting comments. Right now with these power plant rules, we already know that some of these utility companies, some of these fossil fuel companies are planning on submitting comments to say that they think the rule is too harsh and that they think it's going to be too hard to comply and that they want the rule from where it is right now weakened. We want the rule from where it is right now strengthened. So we definitely want to make sure that we're submitting comments, but all of this to say, anytime there's an open comment period, you want to say something, whether it's you like the rule that as it's been suggested, or you would like it to be strengthened.
I think some of our listeners are not very familiar with how administrative regulations work. So if you could kind of, you told us a lot about this, but if you could kind of, maybe from the beginning to the end, give us an idea of how does this process work and how can we be involved in it?
Yeah, so basically, I'm going to use the power plant rules as an example just because it's the one we're currently working on, but the administration will submit a draft rule. So that is what they submitted on May 11th. It was a draft rule saying this is what we are suggesting move forward in terms of power plant emissions. Then they open a comment period. During that comment period, anyone can submit comments. So industry submits comments, activists can submit comments. Those comment periods are generally open for like 60 days. This one opened in late May and is going to be closing August 7th, I want to believe. It's going to be closing in the beginning of August. After that comment period closes, they will look through the comments, see how they feel in terms of strengthening the rule, weakening the rule, leaving the rule as is. Then they will submit a finalized rule. One of the things that we were concerned about was that rule would not be submitted in time for this first term of this administration. Right now on the regulatory docket, it is saying that they plan to submit a finalized rule in March of 2024. That is exactly what we want to hear, because that gives time for that rule to then go through the voting process of being finalized. And once the final rule is proposed, then it goes into action following that. So the next steps right now, after the comment periods closes, would be to wait for the final rule to be approved.
Great. So got a few more questions that may be a little bit out of your area of expertise, but just if you'd like to answer them, great. If not, hopefully we'll get another speaker who can who is focused on that area, but was talking about their concern that the next COP on climate change is being headed by an oil executive. So what do you think about that?
I think it's definitely disappointing that we have seen last year and this year that COP is not necessarily adequately addressing a lot of the concerns we have. It's definitely concerning how embedded the fossil fuel industry is becoming in COP. But I think I take that as just acknowledgement of a lot of the work that needs to be done is going to be done outside of those spaces. A lot of the work that needs to be done is going to be done in spaces like this, where it is people coming together saying that they care about something and pushing for better. This type of organizing, this type of comment collection that we're trying to organize is so important. Evergreen, as of right now, has collected over 55,000 comments for these power plant rules. And that's just the beginning. We're working with partners that are also collecting thousands of comments. We would love to be able to go to the administration and be like, look, here's hundreds of thousands of people who think that this rule needs to be strengthened. And they've made their voices known. And that type of work isn't going to happen at COP. So as frustrating as it is to see that that is not the place for change that we'd like it to be, it's just important to recognize there's so many spaces for that type of change here virtually, here in the United States, all of the things like that.
Great. So do you have any idea how many comments have been made for or against some of these other rules that Evergreen's been looking at in the last year?
So off the top of my head, I can't think of all of them, but I know for the mercury and air toxins rule, we submitted about 10,000 comments. For the CERT standard, I know we submitted maybe 7,000 or 8,000 as well. And we're just working with it, and we're working within a coalition. So those are just the ones that our organization has collected. We work very closely with the Climate Action Campaign, who runs these massive drives to collect comments. We work with, some of the big greens like Sierra Club and NRDC and RMI to collect comments. So while I don't know the exact numbers for the coalitions as a whole, hundreds of thousands of comments have been submitted. I can definitively say hundreds of thousands of comments have been submitted about all of these different rules. And that's just by climate organizations. The unfortunate reality is we know that some of those bad actors are submitting comments too, but we just have to continue to be really smart with how we counteract that, getting as many voices in there in that comment period as possible.
Yeah, great. So another question is focused more on states. Is Washington State can use a growth management act to require local governments to include climate plans in their growth management plans. Do you know if other states have a similar structure? And if you don't, that's fine. You're not the state expert.
I don't, but I do know that Washington State has traditionally been like the, one of the early sites for a lot of this climate action that we're hoping to see on the state level. Evergreen does believe that a lot of the big climate action we're going to see in the next few years is going to come out of states, and as such has started to really invest in a state by state plan of attack, because with how volatile the federal government is, it can be really limiting. We were really, really lucky to get the Inflation Reduction Act passed. And even the Inflation Reduction Act has some provisions in it that we don't really like. At the state level, you can be a lot more strategic about what you're asking for.
I don't know if you've had a chance to listen in on many of the public hearings on these rules, but if you have, what have you been hearing?
So as I've been in the public hearings, generally most of the people that show up to the public hearing are the activists, which is fantastic. That's exactly who we want to see making their voices heard. A lot of the types of comments people make are around public health. There are people living on the fence line of these power plants. They are breathing in these toxins and it is affecting their health. We know that it leads to fertility problems. It leads to increased rates of cancer, things like that. So in some of these public hearings, you're hearing some of these stories of people who have lived in these communities that are affected by this on a public health level. Separate from that, though, a lot of people talk about the climate angle. I know when I go and give public testimony, I've been really fortunate not to grow up in a fence line community, but I have lived in Florida for many years of my life, and I've seen the effect that climate change has had there, whether it's increased strength of hurricanes, whether it is increased algal blooms, whether it's this extreme heat that we're seeing right now. All of these things are connected. And then other folks are talking about, again, about the cost, about how fossil fuels are more expensive and how we shouldn't be paying more for something that's harming us. So there's a lot of different approaches, but most of the public comment are from activists. A lot of these industries that choose to leave public comments that are not as supportive of what we're doing choose to submit those written because there's they don't have to publicly say what they're doing.
Yeah. It's great that actors are showing up at public hearings, and if anybody on this call wants to show up at public hearings, it's a great thing to do. So when I ask, where can we find a map where these plants are located?
I am not sure, and I know one exists because I know that I live not too far from one, actually, because someone at work told me, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. I know that I know a map does exist though, and maybe I can send that to Jen later to forward that on to you all.
If you can, that would be great. So I think we're through most of the questions in the Q&A, but it's quite possible that I missed a question that's in the chat. If I missed your question in the Q&A or in the chat, we're going to get into how the question that we haven't gotten from several people is how can we help, which is how we're going to finish up. But if there's anything else that I've missed or anything you just thought of, please let us know. Also in the chat, a lot of people have, I'm sorry, in the Q&A, people have posted things that are not really questions. They're more resources and things that they're doing, things that organizations they work with are doing, that sort of thing. So if you haven't been reading the Q&A, I would recommend that you do that and see if you can find some interesting things that you're going to want to work with. But I think the big question for everybody is, what can we do at this point to support the work that you're doing?
So that gets to our comment collection, yes?
Mm-hmm.
So I shared the link to our comment collection, but Jen, I know that you had shared that you all are organizing comments as well.
Yes, and our comment was definitely informed by Evergreen Action's work. So there's a lot of similarities in the comments between the two organizations. I did drop it in the chat. I will drop it again. And there's also a link to submit your own comments. So if you want to take our comment and Evergreen Action's comment and you want to write your own comment, we encourage you to do that and submit it yourself. And there's a link to how you can do that. I think even if you use our comment or Evergreen's comment, you, at least with our comment, you have the ability to edit the comment. So you can add some of your own personal story. You can tell the EPA some of the ways that you are being impacted or your community or your family is being impacted. And we really encourage you to do that. Add some of the reason why these rulemakings or these rules, these standards, are meaningful to us and why we want to support them. So use our comment, use Evergreen's comment, submit your own comment. It doesn't really matter to us whose comment you use. We just want you to comment because again, it's just really important that the EPA hears from us. And I think this is one of those rare places where we really do know that our comments and our participation in these rulemakings and these standards, developing these standards actually has a huge impact. Our voices can help inform this decision-making process. So let's use it. Let's make sure that we're submitting our comments. And we at ECA will make sure that as there's more comment opportunities from the EPA, we're going to make sure that you know about those too. We don't suspect that there's going to be a lot of rulemaking happening in the next 12 months. We're hoping that a lot of these rules get finalized, but if anything comes up, we're going to make sure that you know about it.
Someone just pointed out that people may not be able to see what's in the Q&A other than their own questions. So I'm trying to put the things that probably should have gone into the chat that are in the Q&A into the chat, so that you'll have those. Now, unfortunately, some people also have trouble, seeing the chat. If they're just calling in on their phone. Don't worry, you're going to be getting all these links and other information in your email soon. You have the link to submit a comment to the EPA in support of finalizing stronger standards for power plants. And we will give you a link for a pre-written comment that you can edit, or you can submit one of your own, and there's a link for that. And the deadline for this is coming up soon. It's August the 8th, so don't put it off too long. You don't want to get to the 9th and go, oh no, I forgot to do it. Any last questions or comments?
And we'll make sure all of that is delivered to your email inbox sometime tomorrow evening. So you'll find the recording and all of the links tomorrow evening. It's also been brought to our attention that our partners at Climate Reality have an event happening this evening at 8 p.m. And so it looks like we're going to be off with enough time for y'all to be able to shift over to Climate Reality and learn some more great ways to get involved.
One more question if people have time, or two more. What is the IRA or other doing to build renewable energy and energy storage in West Virginia and other coal states so that renewables and batteries are part of their local economies?
I can't really speak specifically to West Virginia, but I know that one of the things that the administration is going to be putting out with the knowledge that we're about to hit the 1-year anniversary of the Inflation Reduction Act is they're going to be putting out a resource that shares where IRA money has gone. I highly recommend you check that out once it comes out, because that'll be really telling of which states are investing in these funds. Because part of it is, some of these states have to go after that money in general, but other parts are like, there's just generally money flowing to states. So that will answer that question better than I really could.
Yeah, being a native of West Virginia, I've probably been tracking this a little bit more than some other people, that there are parts of the IRA where there is a bonus in various programs for building in an energy community. That doesn't mean every part of West Virginia, but it's hard to walk through West Virginia without finding an energy community. Those are communities that are coal mining or affected by coal mining, or fossil fuel power plants, other things along that line. So there's some significant incentives to build new renewables and other similar projects in West Virginia. And one of the reasons we got Senator Manchin to sign on to the IRA was a battery plant that's being built in West Virginia. Another question more related to regulation. In your experience, are pre-written comments as effective as ones that people are writing on their own?
I think that they're all weighed pretty equally. But there is obviously space. Like if you want to submit your own, you're more than welcome to. It's just, this makes it a little easier for you.
Now, I've been told it's helpful to add a personal story. Do you think that's helpful?
I do think it's helpful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and any last questions, comments? Well, thank you so much for coming, and we hope you'll all be submitting your comments to the EPA if you haven't done it already. And thank you so much to Hannah for covering such a wide area, including things she probably was never expecting. And thank you all for being with us. And coming next month, we are going to have our next national call, the Inflation Reduction Act, 1 year later, why we must take action to protect the IRA's Farm Bill funding. That's going to be on Tuesday, August 23rd at 7 p.m. And you're going to have a link to register for that. And we hope to see you all next month, if not before. So take care and enjoy, and maybe we'll see you on the Climate Reality call. Thank you.